This is the current state of my cardboard Iron Man suit, and as you can see, I have made a little bit of progress. In addition to the helmet, the chest plate is now complete, which means this project is finally getting somewhere. While using just cardboard, resin, and magnets, I think I have also managed to make one of the coolest features of this Mark III suit so far. Something that has become a staple for all my projects is the inner support, and that's what I'm working on right now. It might sound odd, but this piece is temporary. I choose to incorporate this technique into my builds because it helps me get the proportions right, while also serving as a starting point for everything else to build off of. With the supports done, I started working on the arc reactor, which began with these three pieces. I scored the outside lightly just so they'd curve easier around the central arc reactor ring, and then I glued them on. These bits were the first in over 100 individual parts that built up the chest plate, so we better get a move on. I'll begin expanding the central ring outwards with these parts. They create a bit of a wider look for the arc reactor, with one of the pieces curving around the other. Once I had both sides done, I glued them together, then attached the semicircle on this dashed line right here. Now, I can make the first connection to the support by gluing this section on at the front. In case you're wondering, what I'm starting with here is the under chest details, which are shown very briefly in Iron Man 1 during the suit up sequence. I've always thought these details were super cool, yet I haven't seen very many people incorporate them into their Iron Man suits, so I want to do that with mine. Continuing the inner chest plate to the side is this piece, and all of the circular marks here line up exactly to the mechanical details peeking through the outer chest plate gaps. I glued both pieces on once they were finished. And that roughly completes the front of the inner chest. Now I need to create a flange on top of what I just built, so the inner chest can sit underneath the finalized outer chest piece. To do that, I have these two pieces here, which will create a wall on the outer edge. Connecting to that wall is this piece, which is the bridge between the front and the back of the chest plate. It gets curved into shape, and the dart is closed with some hot glue. Then I attach it to the flange we just created at the top edge of the inner chest. Towards the back of the piece we just attached, a strut of the inner support gets glued on at this black line, just to keep everything nice and sturdy. With that connected, I moved on to the shoulder strap piece, which gets curved up and then glued on. Towards the top, the shoulder on the inner support lines up on this dashed line, and at the bottom it gets attached on the corner of the front chest piece. Now that this is taking shape, we can expand the arc reactor upwards with this piece, which will really fill out the upper chest and serve as a base for some of the other parts later. If you take a look at the top of the shoulders, the shaping does look a little weird. To fix that, I have these pieces, which end up forming together to create what I assume is a track piece for some sort of mechanical section. It also serves as a brace to hold up the next piece vertically, and you can see me connecting that here. With that, I mounted this newly built shoulder assembly to the inner edge and very back of the shoulder strap panel. This part here goes at the side of the chest, underneath all the layers we've just built. To achieve the distance needed to separate this piece from the layers above it, I added a short wall to the side, and then glued that whole panel on behind the side of the chest. After that piece is glued on, we can take a break from building the front of the chest plate for the moment, and shift our focus to the back. It is made up of 4 basic pieces on either side, which combine together to form a pretty complex shape. The top of the back is a complicated concave curve, which, as you may know, is difficult to achieve with cardboard, so that's why I split up the curve into 2 separate pieces. Each one of them has a slightly different shape than the one prior to it, so when they're all stacked on top of each other, they create a cohesive concave shape. This all gets locked in place with a front piece that also lines the back of the traps. With that done, I continued working downwards with this part, which will fill in the lower back area. It gets curved together and then slotted right in this gap. Once I was done with that whole back section, I repeated the entire process for the other side. Then I joined it to the front half, gluing it on behind the side chest at the hash marks near the bottom. Up at the top, it slots in right next to the backing plate on the upper shoulder. This is the middle back, and it's what will connect what we just built to the supports. I started by gluing these 2 pieces together and then attached them at the top of the back support. Then I began building the walls out with these 2 parts here. After finishing that, I could finally close up the main back panels by gluing them to the middle back section. Speaking of that section, it will eventually be home to the spine pieces once I build them, but that is for another video. To finish off the back half of the chest plate, I began working on the upper back with this inlet detail. Eventually, its purpose in the finished suit will be to hold all the motors and mechanisms that will be used to control the upper back flaps. While the flaps are activated, you will be able to look inside and see a bunch of cool details on this piece here. Finally, I attached this top corner piece on and folded the inner panel in place to round off the back. The chest plate is finally starting to take shape. These two pieces here get glued together and then attached right behind the upper chest panel in order to create some depth for the next piece, which will sit right behind it. This piece is the base for some of the mechanical neck details that are visible on the outside of the suit, and I think it's one of the coolest looking aspects of this project so far. This completed piece gets glued on right behind those filler pieces we just added. The gear track detail is next, which I curved up and then glued right along the side of the shoulder strap. These pieces here will eventually help align the trap armor panels, which I will be building later, and they also serve another function, but I'll explain that later in the video. Once I had both of these pieces completed, I glued them on either side of the chest plate right above the gear track pieces we just built. To cover up the hash lines on the front of the chest plate, I glued this one detail piece on, which makes it look a whole lot cleaner. I could go on and on gluing more details onto this under chest piece, but I really don't want to bore you guys with all that, so why don't we just cut to when that's done? I think this looks pretty good. Although I do want to create the outer armor, the chest plate is very weak as it stands right now, so I'm going to reinforce it with step 2. Resin. Fiberglass resin, which is what I'm using here, has a fairly straightforward application process. Basically, I combined 1 ounce of resin with 10 drops of hardener, mixing it for just under a minute. Once the resin is activated, I don't have much time, with just 8 minutes to apply it, meaning I had to work in smaller sections. Epoxy resin is another good option for this, and it does have a longer working time. However, it isn't as strong as fiberglass resin. While that's drying, it's time to work on my most anticipated part of this project yet, the outer chest plate. Now this is the most recognizable bit of the suit so far, and I find it funny that it's taken this long to get to this part of the build. At this point, I had been working on the entire chest plate for over 2 months, and I had just been getting to the part I was looking forward to. Anyways, I started gluing these 5 pieces together, which makes up the middle of the outer chest piece. Next, I began working on the oblique section of the chest plate, which is made up of 4 simple pieces. Some of the pieces have a dart, which I quickly glued together. Then I took all 4 of those pieces and combined them into one. I then took this section and glued it right onto the other chest piece. The upper chest is next, which is 2 pieces that get curved up and then glued together. I then took that completed subassembly and temporarily glued the bottom edge to the chest plate. Once I had repeated all those steps for the other side, I was left with 2 mirror images of each other that I glued together along the middle. And then I cut off the upper chest, leaving the hash lines still glued onto the lower chest. Once that was out of the way, it gave me access to work on these. These are the chest bolts. This is something you can see on the outside of the actual suit, and for me, I decided to use it as an alignment tool for when the outer chest plate is removed. The reason why I held off on adding these pieces until now is because I figured it would be much easier to find out their precise angle they need to be glued at after the outer chest plate was already built. Once I was happy with the positioning of these pieces, I locked them in place with a bunch of super glue and moved on to working on the last chest panel. This piece is fairly simple and just has 1 dart that needs to be glued closed. Now, at the moment this piece doesn't get attached to anything, but it will eventually go above the chest bolts we just made and below the upper chest. This is the last armor panel for now, the traps. It is made up of 3 fairly simple pieces that get curved in one direction and then glued together. Eventually in my finished suit, I want these pieces to be motorized, and that's because I would like to recreate the missile pod scene from Iron Man 1. That's also why there's some empty space underneath the traps, is because that's where the missiles are gonna go. After the traps get attached to the top of the chest plate, we are finally done with building. There is still much more work to do, and as it stands, everything is fairly flimsy that we just built. To fix that, I went ahead and resined everything in place with the same process as earlier. Much better. Now, the chest plate is pretty strong, which means we don't need these supports anymore, so let's get rid of them. We are getting closer and closer to finally putting this thing on, but it's not quite there yet. The inside is still fairly flimsy, so I'm going to reinforce that with some fiberglass cloth. If you want a more in-depth summary of how I did this, then go check out part 1, Basically, all I did was apply the cloth on the inside and then saturate it with resin. Once it cures, it creates an extremely strong composite material. Now the whole point of building the under chest was so it could be seen, but right now the outer chest is permanently attached to the entire chest piece, so I cut it off. At the moment, this piece isn't very strong, and that's because the inside doesn't have any fiberglass in it, so I went ahead and fixed that. Now this piece is extremely strong. To finish off the outside of this piece, I glued on this poster board ring, which represents a recessed groove that I noticed on the outside of the chest plate. On the inside, I also covered up these 3 gaps with more poster board. There is still one main problem left with the chest plate at the moment, and that is that the outer chest plate and inner chest don't connect. So to fix that issue, I have this piece. This is what's going to allow the outer and inner chest plate to connect, being its main stabilizer. I glued this part to a piece of poster board and then trimmed off the outer edges. The inner circle needs to be removed as well, and to do that, I used my X-Acto knife. Boing. I then filled in all 8 circular gaps with these 3x8 neodymium magnets. I have used way too many of them across this project, but hey, I could not care less. With that whole section done, I then did the exact same thing again, but this time in reverse, so the magnets on each piece would attract to each other. With the new ring, I attach a piece of cardboard on top to seal the magnets in. Here are those 2 magnetic rings, and you may be able to tell where this is going. On the inside of the outer chest, these 3 holes right here allow the magnetic ring to sit much closer to the outside of the chest plate. So, I glued it on with a bunch of super glue. The same thing goes for the inner chest, and the magnetic ring is attached atop the arc reactor ring. However, by gluing on that piece, there is now a new problem. This ugly gap. To fix that, I quickly thought of just covering it up, so that's what this piece is going to do. It gets glued on and then resined in place, along with the inner blue ring as well. Still, that whole assembly I just made is not going to be enough to hold the outer chest on, so I quickly mounted 8 more magnets on either side of the outer chest panel. But that's only one half of the equation. We still need to do some sort of mounting mechanism on the inside, and that's what these pieces are for. On the inside of the outer chest, I started by lining each one of the pieces up in their respective spot, then gluing the magnets in place. These will be removable and will help stabilize each of these lower oblique sections on the chest plate. I hardened them with super glue because I was too lazy to resin them, and then I glued them in place on the inside of the chest plate, once again using more super glue. And here you can see the finalized placement of all 8 magnets on the inside and the outside. But before we can test these out, I need to cut off the upper chest plate once again. To do this, I thought it would make sense to use a Dremel. Now, I have never used one of these before, but it was very easy to get the hang of, and I'm pretty impressed with the results, so this is definitely going in the arsenal of tools to use later on this project. At this point, I had been working on the chest connecting mechanism for several weeks, and I had no clue if it was going to work or not. So, there was only one way to find out, by testing out this mechanism once and for all. And somehow, I was able to make it work. With that success out of the way, now I can focus on putting the thing on. And unfortunately, it is too small for me to squeeze into from the bottom, which means I'll have to cut it here at the back and here along the shoulders. This was a bit challenging to do, but I was able to get it done after a bit of trial and error with my X-Acto knife. And one by one, each of the 4 segments popped out of place, and I was finally able to take the 2 sections apart, which means it's time to figure out how the front and the back. I may have made a mistake here. Now initially, I cut the lower back at this area here, where I thought it would hide the seam pretty well, but that had an unintended consequence. I realized I couldn't even put the thing on, and that was because the gap I'd have to fit into was too small. So, I cut my losses, glued it back together, and then cut it again, but this time underneath the arm. And that was much better. What was I saying? Oh, right. We need to figure out how to connect the front and the back. And to do that, I have these, which are bar magnets. The bar magnets connect together best on the long edge, and they're extremely strong. To house them, I have these pieces here, which will all form together to create a bracket that the magnet will sit inside. I built up a few layers around the magnets with a material called binder board. It is an extremely strong form of cardboard, and I got it from a binder, believe it or not. Once the pieces fit around all the magnets, I reinforced the middle of the back with a small bit of binder board. With that in place, I found the middle on the front side and then cut it in half, right down the line. To attach the magnets to each side, I poked a few holes for some barbecue skewers to sit in, which just so happened to fit through the screw holes on the magnet. Using super glue, I attached it in place. On this specific piece, there's a top shelf that will keep the two magnet sections in alignment when it's on the side. The other side is exactly the same, just without that top shelf. To summarize what I just built, this is the side attachment mechanism. The bar magnets are located here, and they attach side by side to each other. The top shelf on one of the side pieces is keeping the two sections aligned. To attach them to the chest plate, I took the one with the alignment shelf and glued it on the back of the chest plate, on both sides. The other piece was then attached to the front of the chest plate. Initially, I used hot glue to secure each one in place, and then secured them more permanently with super glue. And with a quick test, the side mechanism is now done. So we can go ahead and move on to the shoulder mechanism. To make things simple, I've labeled the pieces 1, 2, and 3. I started with piece 1 by gluing in the magnets, but that quickly went south.
No!
Somehow one of those magnets managed to jump out of place, but I was able to glue it back down.
I glued it to the freaking table.
I quickly reached for the first prying tool I saw, which was a screwdriver.
Okay, well that was stupid.
After that, I started gluing the other side. I don't even know what that sound was, but that was my live reaction just to show how upset I was. Somehow I was able to move past that frustration and finally get the magnets glued in place. What you're seeing here is me finishing up gluing the magnets into piece 2. After that's done, I can take piece 1 and glue it onto the front of the chest plate. When doing this, I made sure that the bottom edge lined up with the very bottom of the shoulder support panel. I did the same on both sides. With those two pieces on, I put the front and back together, and then glued only piece 2 to the very top of the back. Hopefully this will show that a little better. Then I took piece 3 and glued that just to the bottom edge of piece 2, making sure it doesn't connect to piece 1. After that was done, I drilled 2 pilot holes in piece 3 in order to mount the bar magnet. I figured this would be a good solution for attaching the front and the back at the shoulders because of how strong the magnets are. This is where the mechanism is actually going to work. These pieces here, which I'm gluing on, are only getting attached to the front of the chest plate, and I built up around 4 layers of them. This is going to allow some length so the attachment screws have space to go. Once I was happy with their placement, I drilled 2 more pilot holes, resined everything in place to make it all nice and sturdy, and then attached all 4 bar magnets for good. Here is what that mechanism is looking like. You may be a little confused, which is totally okay, but here's a summary of how it works. There are 3 supporting stabilizer magnets in the top of both pieces. The bar magnet on the front half hooks underneath the back one, creating a very strong connection. I hope that made sense. Well, that is it for the chest plate, and it joins the helmet as being the only other part of the suit that is completed. However, the arms are getting somewhere, and those are almost finished as well. Regardless, the chest plate is done for now, and I think it looks pretty good. But what do you guys think? Let me know. Thank you for watching. If you want to see the next part in this series, then make sure to subscribe. I know it may take a while, but trust me, the wait will be worth it. And when this project is done, it's going to look pretty cool. Anyways, see you later.